On behalf of the Heinrich Böll Foundation Southern Africa, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this conference on climate change, resources and migration, old and new sources of conflict in Africa, ? In the discussions that will start this evening and continue over the next day, we aim to take stock of the state of Africa's security architecture and examine it with regards to the growing challenges of global warming, the exploitation of natural resources, and migration or forced migration.
We are certain that this conference is cognizant of the fact that while Africa is the least contributor to environmental hazard, it remains most severely affected by the effects of climate change. Given the nature of African conflicts and their permeation across borders, several existing threats may be seen to be strengthened by climate change, and these include resource conflict, territory and border disputes, migration, failing states, energy, food insecurity, as well as water scarcity. The security implication of climate change as a relatively new consideration means that the extent of its impact is yet to be adequately mapped out. A special effort is needed to further develop the discourse around these security implications in order to add political urgency to the climate change negotiation to be undertaken in Copenhagen towards the end of the year.
In the past, environmental protection was thought to compromise economic growth and social progress. It is now ever more widely recognized that the current model of economic growth has become counterproductive in environmental, social, and economic terms. It puts the welfare of nations at risk, leads to a dangerous race for shrinking fossil resources, and destroys natural capital on which billions of people depend: fish, forests, clean water, and fertile soil. Far from damaging the economy, investing in resource efficiency, in energy savings, water treatment, waste recycling, public transport, and renewable energy sources will lay the foundations for the 21st century green economy.
When we turned the 21st century, particularly within Africa, there was somewhat a collective mind in terms of where we were going, in terms of wanting to reclaim the 21st century, as the Deputy Minister called it. In fact, we were quite agreed that the ideology that underlay this aspiration for the continent was Pan-Africanism. And this was somewhat what drove the development of the AU, the development of the NEPAD, the G8 Africa partnership, and so forth. However, I think in the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen a considerable shrinking, considerable weakening of this normative framework. And this has meant that we have remained reactive rather than proactive in terms of engaging with the emerging threats. Even more worrisome, I think it is leading to countries beginning to think and reflect on how to move and engage with the world alone. And I think this is the threat as far as the African continent is concerned. So that when we look at the last recent international meetings, in particular the G8, the G20 summit, in particular the debates of the non-aligned movement in Sharm el-Sheikh recently, we see a feeble, if any, African voice in terms of a common position. And I think this is a reflection of the weakening normative framework in terms of driving our aspiration as a continent.
I think the debate on climate change as a security issue has come a long way. Back in 2007, the Nobel Peace Prize was shared between Al Gore and the scientists of the IPCC. In the same year, there was an unprecedented debate on climate change at the Security Council. Now, I think 10 years ago, you wouldn't have put Nobel Peace Prize and climate change in the same sentence, but now we're talking about it very much in the same sentence. Climate change has become a foreign policy priority of many countries, the UK, Denmark, Sweden. If you remember back in the race for the US presidency, John McCain called climate change an existential threat to the US. Again, these sort of statements on climate change would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. And this idea of the security impacts of climate change has picked up tremendous momentum. It really seems to have caught the imagination of the international community. But I would suggest that the political rhetoric has outrun the extent of our actual knowledge of what this means at a national level. The security implications of climate change are often talked about with reference to anecdotes from Africa, Darfur, the Turkana region of northern Kenya, distress migration from West Africa, from the West African Sahel, desertification, tensions over the waters of the Nile, and so on. It's become politics by anecdote. Now, in a sense, Africa is being portrayed as the canary in the mine of climate security, the first continent to fully feel the effects of climate change on political and economic stability, basically as a function of two things. One, as a function of its history of ethnic, resource and political conflict, and second, as a result of its reliance on climate-sensitive sectors such as rain-fed agriculture.
If we're trying to explain why it is the case that certain African countries seem to be prone to, they have a proneness or a vulnerability to conflict, what is it? What drives it? After all, these resources are absolutely value neutral. Completely. Diamonds are value neutral. They have no intrinsic value whatsoever. They're not violent. They don't kill people. They don't do anything. It's the exploitation. It's the exchange. It's the utilization and the abuse of those commodities that is conflictual, not the existence of those commodities. So what's the problem? Well, the problem, according to Collier, is either greed. People seek these resources and they're prepared to exploit others. They are prepared to engage in conflictual behavior or violence to secure these a greater share or control of these resources. This could be corporates. It could be kleptocratic states. It could be elites. It could be grievance. It could be going all the way back to Ted Gurr, 1970. Why men rebel, was it? It could be the sense of community grievance. How come people in a particular area get access to those resources and we see no benefit? Or how come those resources are on our land? And in fact, we are the least developed area in our country. How come our land has been spoilt, degraded, polluted? Our water is no longer usable. How come one particular ethnic group or political party or element of that party access those resources and we do not? The general conclusion was a combination of both. There's often grievance, but to sustain conflicts requires greed too. And those natural resources are the fuel to sustain conflict.